The music was so loud I could feel the bass vibrating through my chest as I lay on my own living room couch at 2 a.m, clutching a thin throw blanket that barely covered my shoulders. My daughter Jessica stood over me with her arms crossed, still wearing that smug expression she'd perfected since moving back home 6 months ago. "Mom, we already told you Marcus's friends are using your bedroom for the after party. You can sleep out here for one night, it's not that big of a deal." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Not that big of a deal. Those words echoed in my head as I stared at the ceiling, listening to strangers laugh and shout in the apartment I'd worked 3 jobs to afford, the same apartment where I'd raised 2 ungrateful children who now treated me like an inconvenience in my own home. What they didn't know was that I didn't just own this apartment, I owned the entire building. And tomorrow morning, everything was going to change. My name is Loretta Clarke, and I'm 62 years old. I've lived in apartment 4B of the Riverside Towers for 37 years, ever since my husband David died in a construction accident and left me with 2 toddlers and a mountain of medical debt. Back then, this building was a rundown mess in a neighborhood most people avoided after dark. The hallways smelled like cigarettes and despair, the elevator broke down twice a week, and you could hear every argument through the paper-thin walls. But it was all I could afford, and I was determined to make it work. I took a job at the diner down the street, working the breakfast shift, cleaned office buildings at night, and did bookkeeping for small businesses on weekends. Every spare penny went toward rent, groceries, and keeping Jessica and Marcus in clean clothes that didn't scream charity case to their classmates. I never bought myself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. My winter coat was from a thrift store, my shoes were resold so many times the cobbler knew me by name, and I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror to save $20 every month. Jessica was 8 and Marcus was 6 when I first started dreaming about owning property instead of just paying rent to someone who saw me as nothing more than a monthly check. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after they'd gone to bed, surrounded by bills and bank statements, calculating and recalculating whether I could somehow scrape together enough for a down payment on a small house somewhere. The numbers never worked. I was always 3 steps behind, always playing catch-up, always choosing between fixing the car and buying new school clothes. But I kept those dreams alive anyway, written in a little notebook I hid under my mattress. I drew floor plans of imaginary houses, calculated mortgage payments on properties I'd never be able to afford, and read real estate magazines I picked up for free at the grocery store. My children thought I was crazy, spending my Saturday afternoons walking through open houses in neighborhoods where we'd never belong. Jessica would roll her eyes and complain about missing cartoons, while Marcus would run ahead and touch everything until I had to chase him down and apologize to the realtor. The turning point came when I was 38, and the building went up for sale. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was moving to California to live with her daughter, and she'd grown tired of dealing with maintenance requests and problem tenants. I'd always had a good relationship with her because I paid my rent on time and never complained about the broken dishwasher or the radiator that clanged all night. When she knocked on my door one evening to tell me about the sale, I saw something in her eyes that looked almost apologetic. "Loretta," she said, settling into my secondhand armchair with a cup of coffee I'd made too strong, "I wanted you to hear it from me first. I'm selling the building. The new owners will probably want to renovate and raise the rent significantly. I know this is your home and I'm sorry." I felt my stomach drop to my feet. Rent increases meant displacement, and displacement meant starting over somewhere else, somewhere that might not have good schools or bus routes to my jobs. I'd finally gotten the kids into a rhythm here, finally felt like we belonged somewhere, and now it was all going to disappear because someone with more money had decided our neighborhood was worth investing in. But that night, after Jessica and Marcus were asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with that notebook and did something different. Instead of dreaming about buying a house somewhere else, I started calculating what it would take to buy this building. It seemed impossible at first. Mrs. Chen was asking for $1. $2 million, and I had maybe $8,000 in savings. But I'd been doing bookkeeping for enough small businesses to understand how real estate investments worked, how you could leverage one property to buy another, how tax benefits and rental income could make seemingly impossible numbers add up. I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could about commercial real estate loans, building inspections, and property management. I called every bank in the city asking about investor loans, and most of them laughed at me when I told them my income and savings. But one loan officer, a woman named Patricia, who worked at a small credit union downtown, took me seriously. She explained how I could use the rental income from the other 7 units to qualify for a loan, how my perfect payment history and Mrs. Chen's willingness to hold a second mortgage could make it work. The process took 4 months of paperwork, inspections, appraisals, and more stress than I'd ever experienced in my life. I had to prove every penny of income I'd earned for the past 5 years, document every repair I'd ever made to my apartment, and convince a room full of middle-aged men in suits that a single mother with 3 jobs knew enough about real estate to handle $1 million investment. Jessica and Marcus had no idea what I was doing. As far as they knew, I was just working more hours and being even more obsessive about saving money than usual. When Jessica complained that all her friends had name-brand sneakers and she was stuck with generic ones from the discount store, I didn't tell her that every unnecessary purchase could be the difference between owning this building and being forced to move. When Marcus wanted to sign up for Little League and I said we couldn't afford the equipment, I didn't explain that I was putting every available dollar toward the down payment that would secure our future. The day we closed on the building was the proudest and most terrifying day of my life. I signed my name on more documents than I'd ever seen in one place, wrote a check that emptied my savings account completely, and walked out of that lawyer's office as the owner of 8 rental units, and enough debt to keep me awake at night for the next decade. Mrs. Chen hugged me goodbye and whispered, "Take good care of my building, Loretta. I always knew you had it in you." I didn't tell the kids right away. I wanted to make sure I could handle the first few months of mortgage payments and emergency repairs before I shared the news. Being a landlord turned out to be more complicated than I'd imagined. There were leaky pipes at 3 a.m, noise complaints between neighbors, and tenants who thought they could skip rent because I looked like someone who wouldn't enforce the rules. But I learned quickly, and I was fair but firm. I kept the rents reasonable because I remembered what it felt like to choose between groceries and utilities. I responded to maintenance requests within 24 hours because I knew how frustrating it was to live with broken appliances. I got to know my tenants personally, remembered their birthdays, and brought soup when they were sick because I understood that a building full of strangers was just an investment, but a building full of neighbors was a community. Over the years, I reinvested every penny of profit back into improvements. I replaced the ancient elevator, installed new windows, updated the electrical system, and converted the basement storage area into a small gym for tenants. I learned how to tile bathrooms and fix garbage disposals because paying contractors for every small repair would have bankrupted me. My hands became permanently stained with paint, and my weekends were spent in hardware stores. But slowly, methodically, I transformed that rundown building into something people were proud to call home. Jessica and Marcus grew up thinking we were just lucky to live in a building with a landlord who actually cared about maintenance. When the elevator broke down, it got fixed fast. When other buildings in the neighborhood started falling apart, ours stayed beautiful. When their friends complained about landlords who ignored their calls and raised their rent every year, my kids just shrugged and said we'd never had those problems. I finally told them the truth when Jessica graduated from high school. We were sitting around the kitchen table eating cake and talking about her college plans, and Marcus was complaining about how expensive everything was going to be. That's when I pulled out the building documents and spread them across the table like a winning poker hand. "I have something to tell you both," I said, watching their faces as they tried to process what they were seeing. "I've been keeping a secret for 8 years. I don't just live in this building, I own it." The silence lasted for what felt like an hour. Marcus was the first to speak, and his voice cracked like it had when he was 13. "You own the whole building? Like, all of it?" I nodded, feeling a smile spread across my face that I couldn't contain. "Every apartment, every brick, every mortgage payment. This is our building, and it's going to pay for your college educations." Jessica stared at the deed with my name printed in official-looking font, then looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't quite respect, but it was something close to it. "Mom, how did you even do this? We never had any money." We never had any extra money, I corrected her. There's a difference. Every dollar we didn't spend on things we wanted was a dollar I could put toward things we needed. This building is our security, our future, our way out of living paycheck to paycheck. Marcus picked up the mortgage documents and flipped through them like he was reading a foreign language. So when Mr. Peterson in 2A pays his rent, he's paying you? He's paying the building's mortgage, maintenance costs, property taxes, and insurance, I explained. What's left over goes into savings for emergencies and improvements. And your college funds. That conversation changed something between us, but not in the way I'd expected. I thought they'd be proud of me, impressed by what I'd accomplished, grateful for the sacrifices I'd made to secure their futures. Instead, they seemed almost resentful, like I'd been holding out on them, like I'd let them wear secondhand clothes and eat generic cereal when I was secretly rich. Jessica was the first to start taking advantage. She'd always been manipulative, but now she had ammunition. When I said no to something she wanted, she'd remind me that I owned an entire building and could afford to be more generous.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
When her friends came over, she'd casually mention that we owned the place, like it made her more interesting or important. She started treating our apartment like her personal entertainment space, inviting people over without asking and leaving messes. She expected me to clean up because it's not like we're going to get evicted. Marcus was more subtle, but just as entitled. He started talking about his inheritance like it was money he'd already earned, making plans for what he'd do with his building when I was gone. He'd bring friends over and give them tours like he was the landlord, pointing out improvements I'd made, and talking about property values like he'd been the one researching real estate trends for the past 15 years. Neither of them seemed to understand that owning the building didn't make me wealthy. The mortgage payments were still substantial, maintenance costs were constant, and I still worked multiple jobs to make sure we could weather any financial storms. When the boiler died in the middle of winter, replacing it cost more than I'd saved in 6 months. When Mrs. Rodriguez in 1C lost her job and couldn't pay rent for 3 months, I had to cover her portion of the mortgage payment myself, rather than evict a woman with 2 small children. But try explaining that to 2 young adults who saw building ownership as a golden ticket to easy living. Jessica started bringing home expensive clothes and claiming she'd bought them on sale, knowing I wouldn't question her too closely because she had a part-time job at the mall. Marcus began eating out constantly and charging everything to a credit card he'd somehow obtained without my knowledge. When I confronted them about their spending, they both acted like I was being unreasonably controlling. "You own a building worth $2 million, Jessica said during one particularly heated argument about her credit card bill. "Don't act like we're poor when you're sitting on all that equity." That's when I realized my mistake. By keeping the building ownership secret for so long, I'd robbed them of the opportunity to understand what it actually took to manage property and maintain financial stability. They saw the end result without witnessing the struggle, the sacrifice, the constant worry about making ends meet. In their minds, I'd been lying to them about our financial situation, making them feel guilty about wanting things when I apparently had money all along. College was supposed to be their escape, their chance to grow up and develop some perspective. I paid for Jessica's tuition at the state university, covered her dorm costs, and sent her spending money every month. I did the same for Marcus 2 years later when he started at the community college. I thought that once they were out of the house, managing their own expenses and seeing how expensive life could be, they'd appreciate what I'd provided for them. Instead, they both moved back home after graduation. Jessica finished her communications degree and spent 6 months applying for jobs that were beneath her qualifications, before giving up and deciding she needed to take some time to, quote, figure out her path. Marcus completed his associate degree in business administration and announced he was planning to start his own company, but he needed to live at home while he developed his business plan. Living with adult children was nothing like raising teenagers. At least when they were younger, I could set rules and expect them to follow them. Now they were grown people with their own ideas about how things should work, and unfortunately, their ideas centered around treating me like a roommate they didn't particularly respect. Jessica took over the second bedroom permanently, turning it into what she called her creative space, which meant she'd strung lights everywhere, covered the walls with fabric, and filled every surface with art supplies she never used. She painted the walls without asking, installed shelves that left holes in the drywall, and somehow managed to stain the carpet with something that looked like red wine, but smelled like paint thinner. Marcus claimed the living room as his office, setting up a desk where the coffee table used to be, and running extension cords across the floor to power his computer setup. He'd take conference calls for his imaginary business at all hours, speaking loudly enough that the neighbors complained, and leaving documents scattered across every surface like he was conducting international trade negotiations, instead of browsing the internet for get-rich-quick schemes. The worst part was how they talked to me. Not just the casual disrespect or the assumption that I'd handle all the cooking and cleaning, but the way they spoke about me to their friends. I'd overhear phone conversations where Jessica would complain about living under her mother's roof, as if she was paying rent anywhere else. I'd catch Marcus explaining to someone that he was, quote, temporarily staying with his mom while he got his business off the ground, like I was a convenient stepping stone rather than the person who'd made his education possible. They started bringing friends over constantly, treating our apartment like a social club, where the entertainment was free and the cleanup was someone else's responsibility. Friday nights became party nights. Saturday afternoons were for creative gatherings, where Jessica's art school friends would drink wine and talk loudly about how commercial galleries were destroying authentic expression, and Sunday evenings were reserved for Marcus's networking events, where he'd invite anyone who claimed to be an entrepreneur. I tried setting boundaries. I asked them to check with me before inviting people over, to help with groceries when they were feeding their friends, to keep the noise down after 10 p.m., because I still worked early shifts and needed sleep. They'd agree in the moment, and then completely ignore every conversation we'd had. The first time Jessica told me I'd need to sleep on the couch was 3 months ago. She was planning what she called a vision board party, where a dozen of her friends would come over to create artistic representations of their life goals. She needed the living room for the activity, and my bedroom for people to, quote, decompress and have deeper conversations. It's just one night, Mom, she said, not looking up from her phone as she scrolled through what looked like party planning websites. You can sleep on the couch. It's not that big of a deal. Not that big of a deal. The words hit me like a slap, but I was so shocked by the audacity of the request that I didn't know how to respond. Sleep on the couch in my own home so my daughter could host a party? Give up my bedroom so strangers could have private conversations in the space where I kept my clothes, my personal belongings, my most private thoughts? But I didn't say no. I told myself it was just one night, that she was young and trying to build a social life, that maybe if I was accommodating about this, she'd be more considerate about other things. So I gathered my pajamas and a change of clothes, made up the couch with my own sheets, and spent the night listening to laughter and conversation happening in rooms I wasn't welcome in. The next morning, I found wine stains on my bedspread, makeup smeared on my bathroom towels, and what looked like candle wax dripped onto my dresser. When I mentioned it to Jessica, she shrugged and said accidents happen, that her friends probably didn't realize they were being messy. She offered to wash the bedspread, but when I pulled it out of the dryer, the stains had set permanently. That should have been the end of it. I should have told her that my bedroom was off limits for future parties, that she needed to find other venues for her social events, that I wouldn't be sleeping on my own couch again. But I didn't. I made excuses, told myself it wasn't worth the argument, convinced myself that this was what families did for each other. 2 weeks later, Marcus needed the apartment for a business presentation with potential investors. He asked if I could make myself scarce for the evening, maybe visit a friend or go to a movie, because having his mother around would make him look unprofessional. I spent 4 hours at the library and came home to find pizza boxes stacked on my kitchen counter, beer bottles lined up on my windowsill, and the distinct smell of marijuana hanging in the air. When I asked Marcus about it, he got defensive and accused me of not supporting his entrepreneurial ambitions. He said I was sabotaging his chances of success by questioning his methods, that successful people sometimes had to be flexible about conventional rules. I found out later from Mrs. Patterson in 3B that she'd seen at least 15 people coming and going from our apartment that night, and that the music had been loud enough to disturb her television viewing. The requests became more frequent after that. Jessica needed the apartment for photography sessions, where she'd pose her friends in elaborate costumes and take pictures she claimed were for her portfolio. Marcus needed space for brainstorming retreats with his business partners, which seemed to involve a lot of loud discussion and very little actual work. Sometimes they'd coordinate their events, double booking the apartment so I'd have to find somewhere else to be for entire weekends. The night everything changed started, like all the others. Jessica announced that she was hosting a, quote, celebration of creativity to mark the end of summer, and that she'd need full access to the apartment from 8 p.m. until whenever people decided to leave. Marcus added that he'd invited some of his business contacts to join the party, because mixing creative and entrepreneurial energy would be synergistic for everyone involved. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, realizing that between Jessica's art friends and Marcus's business associates, we were talking about potentially 30 people taking over every room in our home. Just sleep on the couch, Jessica said, the same way she might suggest I wear a different shirt. It's not like you haven't done it before. And that's how I found myself lying on my own couch at 2 a.m, listening to strangers laugh and party in the apartment I owned, in the building I'd sacrificed everything to buy, covered by a throw blanket that barely reached my knees. The bass from someone's portable speaker was vibrating through the floor, making my teeth ache. I could hear glasses clinking in the kitchen, footsteps pounding up and down the hallway, and what sounded like someone moving furniture in my bedroom. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I wasn't thinking about the noise, or the inconvenience, or even the disrespect. I was thinking about the fireproof safe hidden behind the winter coats in my bedroom closet, the one that contained all the building's legal documents, financial records, and lease agreements. I was thinking about the monthly rent checks I deposited every first of the month, the property management company I'd hired last year to handle day-to-day tenant issues, and the clause in every lease that gave me the right to terminate tenancy with proper notice. Most importantly, I was thinking about the fact that Jessica and Marcus had never signed a lease. They'd never paid rent, never put down a security deposit, never agreed to any terms of occupancy. In the eyes of the law, they weren't tenants with rights. They were guests who'd overstayed their welcome. As I listened to someone in my kitchen opening and closing cabinets like they were searching for something, I made a decision that had been building for months. Tomorrow, I was going to remind my children that there's a difference between being welcomed in someone's home and being entitled to it. They were about to learn that all the equity in the world doesn't mean anything if your name isn't on the deed. The next morning arrived with the kind of silence that follows chaos, broken only by the occasional groan from someone nursing a hangover in what used to be my sanctuary. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep on that couch, my neck cramped from the awkward angle, and my back aching from the thin cushions that had never been designed for overnight use. The throw blanket had slipped to the floor sometime during the night, leaving me shivering in my own living room while strangers slept peacefully in beds that belonged to me. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting every movement, and surveyed the damage. Red Solo cups littered every surface like plastic confetti, and the coffee table was sticky with something that might have been spilled beer or melted ice cream. Someone had ground what looked like potato chips into the carpet near the front door, and there were water rings on the wooden end table I'd refinished myself 3 summers ago. The air hung thick with the stale smell of alcohol and too many people in too small a space. In the kitchen, I found evidence of a meal I hadn't cooked and dishes I hadn't used. Pizza boxes were stacked haphazardly on the counter, their grease-stained bottoms leaving marks on the granite I'd saved for 2 years to install. Empty beer bottles stood in formation along the windowsill, and someone had left the refrigerator door slightly ajar, causing the motor to run constantly and my carefully organized leftovers to spoil. The sink was full of glasses and plates that bore the remnants of foods I'd never bought, and the trash can was overflowing with evidence of a party I'd been excluded from in my own home. As I started cleaning up the mess that wasn't mine, I heard movement from the direction of my bedroom. Voices, low and intimate, followed by the sound of someone using my private bathroom. Not the guest bathroom in the hallway that visitors were supposed to use, but my personal space, where I kept my medications, my skincare products, and the few luxury items I allowed myself after years of careful budgeting. That's when something inside me shifted from tired resignation to cold, calculating anger. This wasn't just about one night of inconvenience, or even the ongoing pattern of disrespect. This was about the fundamental violation of treating my home like their personal playground while I became an unwelcome guest in my own life. I walked quietly to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against the wood. Through the thin barrier, I could hear Jessica talking to someone I didn't recognize. A male voice that was definitely not Marcus. They were discussing the apartment like it was a vacation rental, commenting on the size of the closet and the quality of the mattress. The stranger mentioned something about Jessica being lucky to live in such a nice place rent-free, and she laughed in a way that made my skin crawl. "Yeah, my mom's pretty cool about letting me do my own thing," she said, and I could hear the dismissive tone she used when she wanted to sound more independent than she actually was. She understands that creative people need space to express themselves. Creative people need space to express themselves. I'd heard variations of this excuse for months now, and it always came with the implicit understanding that my needs, my comfort, and my right to peaceful enjoyment of my own property came second to whatever Jessica deemed artistically necessary. I backed away from the door and walked to my home office, the small den off the living room where I handled all the building's business. The desk was covered with Jessica's art supplies and Marcus's business documents, because apparently my workspace was also fair game for their projects. I pushed their belongings aside and opened the locked drawer where I kept the most important building documents. The master lease agreements were there, along with the insurance policies, property tax records, and the contact information for every vendor I used for maintenance and repairs. But most importantly, I found the folder labeled Legal Resources that contained the business cards for every attorney, real estate professional, and property management expert I'd worked with over the years. At the very back of the folder was a card I'd hoped I'd never need to use. Elena Rodriguez, attorney at law, specializing in landlord-tenant disputes and property rights. I'd met her at a real estate investment seminar 2 years ago, and she'd given me her card with the advice that property owners should always have legal counsel readily available, even if they hoped never to need it. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The water-stained end table, the ground-in food on the carpet, the overflowing trash can, the evidence of unauthorized parties in my private space. Each photo was a piece of documentation for the legal case I was building, but they were also a record of my own transformation from enabler to enforcer. While I was photographing the damage in the kitchen, I heard footsteps and turned to find Marcus emerging from the bathroom, wearing clothes that looked like he'd slept in them, and hair that suggested he'd had a better night than I had. He saw me with the phone and frowned. "What are you doing, Mom?" "Documenting the condition of my apartment after your party last night." He rubbed his eyes and moved toward the coffee maker, apparently assuming I'd already prepared his morning caffeine. When he found the pot empty, he looked genuinely surprised, as if my failure to anticipate his needs was a personal affront. "Why are you being so dramatic?" "It's just some cups and plates. We'll clean it up later." "Like you cleaned up after the last party? Or the one before that?" Marcus opened the refrigerator and pulled out a carton of orange juice, drinking directly from the container, despite my repeated requests that he use a glass. "You're acting like we trashed the place. It's not that bad. There are strangers sleeping in my bedroom, Marcus. People I've never met spent the night in my personal space while I slept on the couch. How is that not that bad?" He shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both indifference and mild annoyance at having to explain himself. "Jessica needed the space for her friends. It's not like you were using the room anyway since you were out here." The circular logic was breathtaking. I was sleeping on the couch because they'd commandeered my bedroom, and now my displacement was being used as justification for why the bedroom wasn't really mine to begin with. It was the kind of reasoning that would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. "I was on the couch because you and your sister decided I needed to be on the couch. This is my apartment, Marcus. My name is on the lease, my money pays the mortgage, and my decisions should determine who sleeps where." "Our money pays the mortgage," he corrected, and there was something in his tone that made me set down my phone and give him my full attention. "Excuse me? You said your money pays the mortgage, but you own this whole building. The rent from the other apartments covers the payments. So really, it's the tenant's money that pays for everything." I stared at him for a long moment, trying to process the depth of misunderstanding contained in that statement. Here was my son, who'd lived rent-free for 6 months, eaten my food, used my utilities, and treated my home like his personal entertainment venue. now explaining to me that I wasn't really paying for anything because the building's rental income covered the mortgage. Marcus, who do you think collected that rent money? Who managed those tenants, handled their maintenance requests, and took the financial risk of buying this building in the first place? Well, yeah, but that's just property management stuff. It's not like a real job where you have to work for someone else. A real job. I felt something snap inside me, a thread of patience that had been stretched too thin for too long. This was my son, who'd never held a job for longer than 3 months, explaining to me that property management wasn't real work. This was the child I'd raised while working 3 jobs, dismissing the career that had made his education possible as somehow less legitimate than his imaginary business ventures. "Get out," I said quietly. "What?" "Get out of my kitchen. Get out of my apartment. Get your sister and all of her friends and get out of my home." Marcus laughed, the same dismissive sound he'd been making since childhood whenever he thought I was being unreasonable. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. Where are we supposed to go?" "That's not my problem anymore." The laughter died on his lips as he realized I wasn't bluffing. "You can't just kick us out. We live here." "No, you don't. You're staying here temporarily as my guests, and I'm asking you to leave." "You can't do that. We have rights." "What rights?" "Show me the lease you signed. Show me the rent receipts. Show me any legal document that gives you the right to live in my apartment." He stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. In all the months they'd been treating my home like their personal playground, it had apparently never occurred to either of them that their occupancy was entirely dependent on my goodwill, and that goodwill was now officially exhausted. "This is crazy, Mom. You're having some kind of breakdown or something. We're family. Family respects each other. Family contributes to the household. Family doesn't force their mother to sleep on the couch so strangers can party in her bedroom. You stopped being family the moment you started treating me like unpaid help in my own home." I heard Jessica's voice from the bedroom, calling for Marcus to bring her some coffee. The entitled tone, the assumption that he would serve her breakfast in bed like she was staying at a hotel, was the final confirmation that my decision was correct. These weren't my children anymore. They were parasites who happened to share my DNA. Marcus stood there for another moment, apparently waiting for me to take it back, to apologize for my outburst and return to our previous dynamic, where I absorbed their disrespect with grateful silence. When I didn't soften, didn't smile, didn't offer any indication that this was temporary anger rather than permanent change, he finally spoke again. "Fine. We'll leave today, but we're taking our stuff with us. You have 1 hour." "1 hour?" "Mom, we have months of belongings here. Jessica's art supplies alone will take half a day to pack." Then she should have thought about that before she decided my bedroom was her guest room. 1 hour, Marcus. After that, I'm calling the police and reporting trespassers. He opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to realize I was serious. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the bedroom where Jessica was still holding court with whatever friend had spent the night in my bed. I heard him explaining the situation in hushed, urgent tones, followed by Jessica's voice rising in indignation. "She can't do that. This is insane. What's gotten into her?" I didn't wait to hear Marcus's response. I had work to do. The first call I made was to Elena Rodriguez's emergency line. When she answered, I explained that the situation had escalated and I needed immediate advice on the proper procedures for removing unwanted occupants. "Since they're not on a lease and haven't established legal tenancy, you have the right to ask them to leave immediately," she confirmed. "However, I'd recommend giving them written notice and documenting their response. If they refuse to go voluntarily, we can pursue formal eviction proceedings, but it's better if they leave on their own." "They're packing now. I gave them 1 hour." "Good." "Document everything. Take photos of any damage they've caused, keep records of any threats or hostile statements, and don't let them take anything that belongs to you or the apartment." The second call was to my friend Patricia, who managed properties across town. I'd met her through the real estate investment group, and she'd become one of my closest confidants over the years. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the concern in her voice the moment I started speaking. "Loretta, you sound terrible. What's happening?" I explained the situation quickly, trying to keep my voice steady, as I described the months of escalating disrespect and the final straw of being forced to sleep on my own couch. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Honey, you should have done this months ago. I've been watching you sacrifice your peace of mind for 2 kids who don't appreciate anything you've given them. I kept thinking they'd grow out of it, that they'd eventually realize how good they had it and start showing some gratitude. Some people never learn gratitude, especially when they've never had to live without the things they take for granted. You did the right thing. Patricia offered to come over and help with the transition, but I declined. This was something I needed to handle myself, a line I needed to draw without anyone else's support or intervention. I thanked her and promised to call if I needed backup. The third call was to my building's property management company. I'd hired them the previous year to handle day-to-day tenant issues, collect rent, and coordinate repairs, but I'd kept my own unit under personal management. Now I needed their advice on security procedures and documentation. Mrs. Clarke, we can have someone there within 2 hours if you need assistance with the removal, the manager offered. We've handled similar situations with family members who refuse to leave voluntarily. I don't think it will come to that, but I appreciate knowing the option is available. We'll also need to update our records to reflect that your unit is no longer occupied by additional residents. Do you want us to coordinate changing the locks? I hadn't thought about the locks, but of course both Jessica and Marcus had keys. Even after they left, they could potentially return whenever they wanted, bringing friends for impromptu gatherings, or simply walking in like they still lived there. Yes, please arrange for the locks to be changed today if possible. I want new keys for the deadbolt and the chain lock. We'll have someone there this afternoon. By the time I finished making my phone calls, I could hear frantic activity from the bedrooms. Drawers slamming, closet doors banging, and what sounded like furniture being moved around. Jessica's voice carried through the apartment as she directed her overnight guest in packing what I assumed were art supplies and personal belongings. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the chaos unfold with the detached calm of someone who'd finally stopped being responsible for other people's emergencies. When Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, her hair uncombed and her makeup smeared from the previous night, I was prepared for the confrontation. Mom, this is completely insane. You can't just kick us out with no notice. Where are we supposed to go? That's something you should have considered before you turned my bedroom into a guest room for strangers. It was one night. And David isn't a stranger. He's my friend from art school. David is a man I've never met who slept in my bed without my permission. That makes him a stranger, Jessica. She stared at me like I'd spoken in tongues. You're really doing this? You're really choosing to destroy our family over one party? I'm not destroying anything. I'm reclaiming my home from 2 adults who've been treating me like an unpaid servant in my own apartment. We never treated you like a servant. You make me sleep on the couch so your friends can use my bedroom. You fill my apartment with strangers without asking my permission. You eat my food, use my utilities, and contribute nothing to the household expenses. What would you call that? Jessica's face crumpled in a way that might have softened my resolve 6 months ago, but now it just looked like calculated manipulation. Mom, we're your children. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It meant everything to me. That's why I worked 3 jobs to buy this building, why I paid for your education, why I've supported you both for months while you figured out your lives. But being my child doesn't give you the right to treat me with contempt in my own home. We never treated you with contempt. Last night you told me to sleep on the couch like it was the most natural thing in the world. You've been letting strangers use my private space for months. You've turned my living room into Marcus's office and my spare bedroom into your art studio without asking if that was okay with me. If that isn't contempt, what would you call it? She opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to realize she had no defense. Instead, she changed tactics, moving from denial to bargaining. Okay, maybe we got a little too comfortable. But we can fix this. We'll pay rent going forward. We'll ask before having people over. We'll be more respectful. It's too late for that, Jessica. It's not too late. We can make this work if you just give us another chance. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw a 24-year-old woman who'd never faced a consequence she couldn't talk her way out of. Even now, caught red-handed in behavior that would have gotten her evicted from any other living situation, she was negotiating like this was a temporary setback rather than the logical result of months of escalating disrespect. You've had 8 months of chances, Jessica. Every time I asked you to be more considerate, every time I tried to set boundaries, every time I expressed discomfort with the way you were treating my home, that was a chance. You chose not to take any of them seriously. But we're family. Family members treat each other with respect. They contribute to the household. They don't force their mothers to sleep on couches so strangers can party in their bedrooms. You stopped being family when you started being entitled house guests who showed no gratitude for what they were receiving. Marcus appeared behind her, carrying a duffel bag and wearing the sullen expression he'd perfected as a teenager whenever he was forced to face consequences for his actions. This is really happening? You're really kicking us out? You're really leaving. The difference is that you're choosing to go rather than choosing to change your behavior. We said we'd change. You said you'd change 5 minutes ago when you realized I was serious about eviction. Where was this willingness to compromise for the past 8 months? Neither of them had an answer for that, because we all knew the truth. They'd been perfectly happy with the arrangement as long as I was the one making all the sacrifices and absorbing all the inconvenience. It was only now, when their comfortable situation was threatened, that they were interested in negotiation. You have 30 minutes left, I said, glancing at the clock on the microwave. I suggest you use the time for packing rather than arguing. Jessica burst into tears, the kind of dramatic sobbing she'd used to get her way since childhood. But I'd learned something important over the past few hours. I wasn't responsible for managing her emotions, especially when those emotions were the result of consequences she'd brought on herself. Mom, please, we're sorry. We'll do better. I believe you'll do better once you're responsible for your own housing and have to face the consequences of your choices. That's a lesson I should have taught you years ago. They retreated to finish packing, and I heard the muffled sounds of frantic phone calls as they tried to arrange temporary places to stay. Part of me wondered if they'd land on their feet, if this shock would be the wake-up call they needed to start taking responsibility for their own lives. But mostly, I felt the kind of peace that comes from finally stopping a pattern that had been slowly destroying my mental health and sense of self-worth. At exactly 1 hour after I'd given them notice, I heard the front door close with unusual quietness. No slamming, no dramatic exits, just the soft click of a lock turning and the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. I waited 10 minutes before checking to make sure they were really gone, and when I opened the door, the hallway was empty except for a few forgotten art supplies and what looked like one of Marcus's business binders. I left their abandoned belongings in the hallway and closed the door behind me, turning the deadbolt and sliding the chain lock into place. Then I walked through my apartment, room by room, assessing the damage and beginning to reclaim the space that was finally completely mine again. The silence was profound. No music, no voices, no sounds of other people living their lives in my space without regard for my comfort or needs. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. It was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in months. The locksmith arrived 3 hours after Jessica and Marcus left, a weathered man named Tony, who'd been changing locks in the neighborhood for 20 years. He took one look at the scratches around my deadbolt and shook his head sympathetically. Kids? He asked, pulling his tools from a worn leather bag. Adult children who forgot they were guests in someone else's home. Tony chuckled as he began removing the old hardware. I get a lot of calls like this. Parents who thought they were helping their kids get back on their feet, only to find out their kids had no intention of getting back on anything, except their parents' generosity. As he worked, I walked through the apartment with fresh eyes, seeing my space the way it was meant to be, rather than the way it had been transformed by two people who'd treated it like their personal playground. The living room looked enormous without Marcus's desk setup dominating the center of the floor. The kitchen felt peaceful without Jessica's art supplies covering every available surface. Even the air seemed cleaner, without the constant presence of people who'd never learned to clean up after themselves. But it wasn't just the physical space that felt different. Something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with this apartment, with this building, with my own sense of authority over my life. For months, I'd been walking on eggshells in my own home, trying not to disturb the delicate ecosystem my children had created around their comfort and convenience. Now, for the first time in almost a year, I felt like the owner, rather than the caretaker. Tony finished installing the new locks and handed me a set of keys that felt heavier than the old ones, as if they carried the weight of my reclaimed independence. You want me to check the other locks in the building while I'm here? Sometimes when family situations get complicated, it's worth making sure all your security is up to date. I hadn't thought about that, but he was right. Jessica and Marcus both had keys to the main building entrance and knew the security codes for the basement and laundry facilities. They could potentially still access common areas, and given their sense of entitlement about my apartment, I wouldn't put it past them to feel equally entitled to the rest of the building. Yes, please change the main entrance locks and reprogram the security system. I'll give you the new codes to distribute to the current tenants. While Tony worked on the building security, I started making phone calls to undo the various ways Jessica and Marcus had integrated themselves into my life and business. The first call was to my bank, where I removed them as authorized users on my checking account. They'd never actually used this access, but I'd added them years ago in case of emergencies, and now it felt like a vulnerability I couldn't afford. The second call was to my insurance agent, where I updated my renter's insurance policy to reflect that I was the sole occupant of my unit again. The agent mentioned that having unauthorized long-term guests could have voided my coverage if anything had happened during one of their parties, a risk I'd never even considered. Mrs. Clarke, I have to ask, were these guests contributing to household expenses or helping with rent? No, they were my adult children. They weren't paying rent. And they were hosting social gatherings in your unit? Regular parties, yes. Why? You might want to review your liability coverage. If someone had been injured during one of these parties, especially if alcohol was involved, you could have been held responsible for damages. The fact that you weren't receiving any compensation for their occupancy makes it even more complicated from a legal standpoint. I felt a chill run down my spine as I thought about all the strangers who'd been in and out of my apartment over the past few months. David, Jessica's friend who'd slept in my bed, was just the most recent example. There had been dozens of others, people whose full names I didn't know, whose backgrounds I'd never checked, who'd had access to my personal belongings and could have potentially stolen from other tenants, or caused property damage that I'd be responsible for. The third call was to my accountant, a precise woman named Margaret who'd been helping me manage the building's finances since I'd bought it. I explained that I needed to review my tax strategy now that I was no longer supporting 2 adult dependents. Loretta, I have to say, this is probably the best financial decision you've made in years. Supporting 2 adults who weren't contributing to your household was costing you money you couldn't really afford. What do you mean? Well, let's look at the numbers. Your food budget doubled when they moved in. Your utility bills increased by about 40%. You've been buying additional household supplies, paying for streaming services you didn't use, and covering incidental expenses that added up to several $100s a month. Then there's the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost. You could have been renting your unit as a furnished apartment for at least $1,500 a month. Instead, you are housing 2 adults for free and absorbing additional expenses. Over the 8 months Jessica lived there, you lost at least $15,000 in potential income and spent probably another $3,000 on their additional expenses. $18,000. That was more than I'd saved in emergency funds for building repairs, more than I'd set aside for potential vacancy losses, more than I'd invested in property improvements in the past 2 years. I'd been subsidizing my children's lifestyle to the tune of over $2,000 a month without even realizing it. Margaret continued, and that's not counting the intangible costs. The stress on your living situation, the potential liability issues from their parties, the wear and tear on your unit from additional occupants. From a purely financial perspective, you've been running a charity that was bleeding money. After I hung up with Margaret, I sat in my quiet living room and tried to process the full scope of what I'd been allowing. It wasn't just that Jessica and Marcus had been disrespectful or entitled. They'd been actively costing me money I couldn't afford while preventing me from earning income I desperately needed. Every month they'd lived there rent-free was a month I could have been building my savings, improving the building, or preparing for my own retirement. But the financial revelation was just the beginning. As the afternoon wore on, I started receiving text messages from both of them, and the tone was very different from the tearful apologies they'd offered during their hasty departure. Jessica's first message arrived around 4 o'clock. Mom, I talked to David's dad who's a lawyer, and he says you can't just evict family members without proper notice. We're coming back to get the rest of our stuff tomorrow. I stared at the message for a long moment, amazed by the speed with which she'd moved from remorse to legal threats. Less than 6 hours after leaving my apartment in tears, she was already consulting attorneys and making demands about returning to collect belongings. Her second message came 20 minutes later. Also, we left some important documents in the apartment. You need to let us in to get them, or you could be charged with theft. Marcus's approach was more direct. Mom, this is ridiculous. We're family, and families work things out. Stop being so dramatic and let us come home. His follow-up was less diplomatic. You're going to regret this. Wait until people find out how you treated your own children. I screenshotted all of their messages and forwarded them to Elena Rodriguez, along with a brief note asking for advice on how to respond. She called me back within an hour. Loretta, these messages actually work in your favor. They demonstrate that your children view your apartment as their home, which supports your position that they were taking advantage of your hospitality rather than establishing legal tenancy. However, I'd recommend not responding to them directly. What about their claim that they have important documents in the apartment? Did you see them remove any personal papers during their packing? I thought back to the frantic hour of boxes and bags being carried out of my apartment. Both Jessica and Marcus had taken multiple trips to their cars, and I'd seen them carrying what looked like file folders and computer equipment. They seemed to take everything they considered important. I haven't found any documents that obviously belong to them. Then I'd suggest you document what's left behind and store it safely, but don't allow them back into the apartment. If there are truly important documents they forgot, they can provide you with a specific list, and you can retrieve the items yourself. Don't give them access to your space again. Elena's advice made perfect sense, but it also highlighted something I hadn't fully processed yet. Jessica and Marcus weren't just angry about being asked to leave. They were strategizing about how to get back in. The legal threats, the claims about forgotten documents, the emotional manipulation about family relationships, these weren't random responses born of hurt feelings. They were calculated attempts to regain access to the comfortable arrangement they'd been forced to give up. That realization led me to another uncomfortable truth. My children hadn't just been taking advantage of my generosity. They'd been actively working to maintain and expand their control over my living space, my resources, and my life. The parties weren't just social gatherings. They were demonstrations of ownership. The mess wasn't just carelessness. It was marking territory. The constant presence of their friends wasn't just youthful socializing. It was a way of making me feel like a guest in my own home. I spent the evening going through the apartment room by room, collecting anything that might belong to Jessica or Marcus and storing it in clearly labeled boxes. Most of what they'd left behind was exactly what I'd expected. Old magazines, cheap electronics, clothing that had been abandoned rather than packed. But in Jessica's former art space, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind one of her canvases was a folder containing printed emails and documents that appeared to be correspondence with real estate agents. As I read through them, I realized Jessica had been researching the value of my building and making inquiries about selling individual units as condominiums. The emails were dated from several months ago, long before our final confrontation, and they included detailed questions about my property's potential for conversion and sale. One email thread was particularly disturbing. Jessica had contacted a real estate attorney asking about the rights of adult children living in property owned by their parents, specifically whether long-term occupancy could establish any legal claim to ownership or inheritance. The attorney's response was professional but clear. Simply living in a parent's property didn't create any ownership rights, but children who could prove they'd contributed to property improvements or management might have claims against an estate. The final email in the thread was Jessica's response. What if we've been helping with tenant management and building maintenance? Would that change anything? They hadn't been helping with tenant management or building maintenance. But the fact that Jessica was researching ways to establish legal claims against my property while living in my apartment rent-free was a betrayal so profound that I had to sit down to process it. I called Elena Rodriguez immediately, even though it was after business hours. I found something you need to see, I said when she answered. Evidence that my daughter was researching legal ways to claim ownership of my building while she was living here. Bring everything to my office first thing Monday morning. Don't discuss this with anyone else, and don't confront Jessica about it. We need to review these documents carefully and determine what legal protections you need to put in place. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen with the folder of emails spread across the table, trying to understand how I'd failed so completely as a parent that my own children would plot to steal my life's work. The building represented 30 years of sacrifice, decades of careful financial planning, and the security I'd built for my old age. It was the tangible result of every extra shift I'd worked, every luxury I'd foregone, every choice I'd made to ensure my children would inherit something of value. And they'd been scheming to take it from me while I was still alive. The next morning brought a knock on my door that I'd been expecting but dreading. Through the peephole, I could see Jessica and Marcus standing in the hallway with a man I didn't recognize, someone in a suit, who was probably the lawyer Jessica had mentioned. They knocked again, more insistently, and I heard Jessica's voice calling through the door. "Mom, we know you're in there. We just want to get our stuff and talk about this reasonably." I didn't answer. Elena had been clear that I shouldn't engage with them directly, especially not with a lawyer present. Instead, I called the building's property management company and reported unauthorized individuals attempting to gain access to my unit. "We can have security there in 15 minutes, the manager offered. "Do you want us to ask them to leave the building?" "Yes. They're no longer residents, and they don't have permission to be here." Within 20 minutes, I heard different voices in the hallway as the property management team arrived. Through my door, I could hear a professional but firm conversation about trespassing and the rights of property owners to exclude unwanted visitors. Jessica's voice rose in protest, but the security guard's response was calm and final. "Ma'am, you'll need to leave the building. If you have belongings to collect, you can arrange that through the property management office with proper documentation and supervision." After they left, I realized something had fundamentally changed in how I viewed this situation. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a legal matter involving people who happened to be related to me, but who had demonstrated that our shared DNA didn't create any obligation for me to tolerate theft, disrespect, or attempts to claim my property. I spent the rest of the morning researching estate planning attorneys and asset protection strategies. If Jessica was already plotting to claim ownership of my building, I needed to ensure that my property was structured in a way that made such claims impossible. I also needed to understand what other vulnerabilities I might have that I hadn't considered. The attorney I contacted, Robert Chen, specialized in protecting real estate assets from family disputes and potential litigation. When I described my situation during our phone consultation, he immediately understood the urgency. "Mrs. Clarke, adult children who feel entitled to their parents' property can be more destructive than any outside threat. They know your assets, they understand your vulnerabilities, and they often have emotional leverage that makes it difficult for parents to take protective action. The fact that your daughter was already researching legal claims suggests this isn't a spontaneous reaction to being asked to leave. What can I do to protect myself?" Several things. First, we need to review your current estate planning documents and ensure they clearly reflect your intentions. Second, we should consider restructuring your property ownership to make it more difficult for anyone to challenge your control. Third, we need to document everything that's happened so far and establish clear boundaries going forward. Robert scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon, and I spent the time before our meeting gathering every document related to my building ownership, my relationship with Jessica and Marcus, and the evidence of Jessica's research into claiming my property. As I organized the paperwork, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Margaret about the financial cost of supporting my children. $18,000 was significant, but it paled in comparison to the potential loss of the entire building if Jessica's legal research had uncovered some vulnerability I wasn't aware of. The building was worth approximately $2 million now, with a remaining mortgage balance of about $600,000. The equity represented my entire retirement fund, my only significant asset, and the legacy I'd planned to leave behind. If Jessica and Marcus could somehow establish legal claims against the property, they wouldn't just be stealing my current security, they'd be destroying my future, and potentially leaving me destitute in my old age. That afternoon, Robert Chen reviewed my documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood that family disputes over property could destroy lives. He asked detailed questions about my children's access to building records, their knowledge of my financial situation, and any statements they'd made about inheritance or ownership expectations. The good news is that your property ownership is clearly documented and they have no legitimate legal claims, he said after reviewing everything. The concerning news is that your daughter's research suggests she's looking for ways to create claims where none exist. How could she do that? There are several potential strategies people use to challenge property ownership. They might claim they contributed to mortgage payments or property improvements. They might argue that promises were made about inheritance that created binding obligations. They might try to establish that long-term occupancy created some form of tenancy rights. Most of these claims fail in court, but they can tie up property in litigation for years and cost tens of thousands of dollars to defend against. Robert recommended several immediate steps to protect my assets. First, I needed to create a comprehensive documentation trail of all interactions with Jessica and Marcus going forward. Second, I should consider transferring the building into a trust structure that would make it more difficult to challenge. Third, I needed to review and update my will to clearly state my intentions and eliminate any ambiguity about inheritance. I also recommend that you cease all financial support for your children immediately, he said. No loans, no gifts, no assistance with their housing or living expenses. Any ongoing financial relationship creates opportunities for them to claim they were contributing to your support or that you were dependent on them in some way. The irony wasn't lost on me. My attorney was advising me to stop helping my children in order to protect myself from my children. The relationship had become so toxic that continued generosity was actually a legal liability. As I drove home from Robert's office, I thought about the phone call I'd received from Patricia earlier that morning. She'd wanted to check on how I was handling the aftermath of asking Jessica and Marcus to leave, and I'd told her about the legal threats and the discovery of Jessica's property research. Loretta, you need to understand something, Patricia had said. This isn't about one bad night or even months of disrespectful behavior. Your children see you as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. The legal research proves that they were never planning to become independent. They were planning to take over. Take over. The phrase had been echoing in my mind all day, because it perfectly captured what I'd been sensing, but hadn't been able to articulate. Jessica and Marcus hadn't just been taking advantage of my hospitality. They'd been systematically working to establish control over my home, my resources, and ultimately my property. The parties weren't just social events, they were ways of normalizing their authority over my space. The disrespect wasn't just bad manners, it was a deliberate strategy to undermine my confidence in asserting my own rights. And I'd been enabling it every step of the way by prioritizing family harmony over my own well-being. That evening, I received another round of text messages from both Jessica and Marcus. This time, the tone was more desperate, but still manipulative. Jessica wrote, "Mom, I don't understand why you're being so cruel. We're your children and we love you. Can't we find a way to work this out? I promise things will be different if you just give us another chance." Marcus was more direct. "This is insane. You're destroying our family over a stupid misunderstanding. Just let us come home and we'll figure out a better arrangement." I didn't respond to either message. Instead, I forwarded them to both Elena Rodriguez and Robert Chen, adding them to the documentation trail that was becoming an essential part of protecting myself from people who shared my DNA, but not my values. As I prepared for bed in my quiet, peaceful apartment, I realized that the silence I'd been enjoying wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of conflict, manipulation, and the constant stress of trying to maintain boundaries with people who didn't respect them. For the first time in months, I could go to sleep in my own bed without worrying about who might be using my space, eating my food, or plotting to claim my property. The next morning, I woke up naturally, rather than being jolted awake by music, voices, or the sounds of people who thought my home was their entertainment venue. I made coffee in a kitchen that stayed clean because only I was using it. I showered in a bathroom where my personal items hadn't been moved or used by strangers. I dressed in a bedroom where my clothes were exactly where I'd left them and my privacy was intact. It was the most peaceful morning I'd experienced in almost a year, and it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect during the legal consultations and difficult conversations of the previous few days. This wasn't just about reclaiming my apartment or establishing boundaries with my children. This was about reclaiming my entire life from people who'd been slowly, systematically taking it away from me piece by piece. And I was just getting started. The trust documents were finalized on a Tuesday morning in Robert Chen's office, surrounded by the kind of legal formality that makes life-changing decisions feel both momentous and mundane. I signed my name 17 times across various papers that effectively moved my building from my personal ownership into an irrevocable trust, where I retained control during my lifetime, but eliminated any possibility of future challenges from Jessica or Marcus. This structure protects your property from any claims your children might attempt to make, Robert explained as I initialed the final pages. They can no longer argue that long-term occupancy created rights. They can't claim they contributed to the property in ways that established ownership interests, and they can't challenge your decisions about inheritance. The trust also included provisions I'd never thought I'd need to consider. If anyone attempted to contest my mental competency or claim I was being manipulated or coerced, the trust included detailed documentation of my decision-making process and independent psychological evaluation confirming my sound mind. It seemed excessive until Robert explained that adult children challenging their parents' property decisions often tried to claim diminished capacity as a way to overturn legal documents. Your daughter's research into property claims suggests she's been thinking about this systematically, he said. People who plan that carefully often have backup strategies. As I left Robert's office with copies of all the trust documents secured in a fireproof folder, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in my financial future. No matter what legal maneuvers Jessica and Marcus might attempt, no matter what emotional manipulation they might try, my building was protected, and my retirement was secure. But the legal protections were only part of the transformation that had been building since that night. I'd slept on my own couch. The real change was in how I thought about myself, my relationships, and my right to live without constantly managing other people's emotions or expectations. 3 weeks after the trust was finalized, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I hired a property management company to take over all aspects of running my building, including collecting rent, coordinating repairs, and handling tenant relations. The monthly fee would reduce my income by about $800, but it would also eliminate the constant responsibility of being available for every minor crisis or maintenance request. "Mrs. Clarke, are you sure about this?" asked Sandra Mills, the property manager I'd chosen. "You've done such a good job managing this building yourself. Most owners your age are looking to get more involved in their properties, not less." "I want to travel," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I want to visit places I've never seen and do things I've been postponing for 30 years. I can't do that if I'm tied to this building every day." Travel. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I'd studied but never practiced. For decades, my life had been defined by responsibility. To my children, to my tenants, to the building that had become both my greatest achievement and my heaviest burden. I'd never taken a vacation longer than a weekend, never been on an airplane, never stayed in a hotel, just for the pleasure of being somewhere different. But now, with Jessica and Marcus out of my apartment, and my property legally protected from their schemes, I realized I had both the freedom and the resources to live differently. The building's rental income exceeded my living expenses by a comfortable margin, especially without the hidden costs of supporting 2 adults who'd never learned to support themselves. For the first time since David died, I had discretionary income that I could spend on myself without feeling guilty or irresponsible. I started small, booking a weekend trip to Charleston that felt extravagant and terrifying in equal measure. I'd never traveled alone, never navigated an airport by myself, never slept in a bed that hadn't been mine, or stayed in someone else's space without feeling obligated to help with dishes or make conversation with the hosts. The hotel room was a revelation. Clean sheets I hadn't washed, towels I hadn't folded, a bathroom I didn't have to share with anyone else's belongings. I could watch television without considering anyone else's preferences, order room service without checking if someone else wanted something different, and go to sleep without worrying about being woken up by music or voices, or the sounds of people who treated my space like their playground. On the second day of the trip, I was sitting in a cafe overlooking the harbor when my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I felt the old familiar anxiety, the automatic assumption that I needed to answer and manage whatever crisis or demand was coming. Instead, I let it go to voicemail and continued eating my lunch while watching boats navigate the channel. When I finally listened to the message an hour later, Jessica's voice was carefully controlled but tinged with the kind of frustration that suggested this wasn't her first attempt to reach me. "Mom, we need to talk. Marcus and I have been staying with friends, but that's not sustainable long term. We're willing to compromise about the apartment situation, but you need to be reasonable too. Call me back." The assumption that I needed to be reasonable, that I was the one creating problems by refusing to house two adults who'd been plotting to claim my property, was exactly the kind of manipulation I'd been accepting for months. But sitting in that Charleston cafe, hundreds of miles away from the building and the relationships that had defined my life for so long, I could see the message for what it was: an attempt to reestablish control over my decisions. I deleted the voicemail without responding and blocked both Jessica's and Marcus's numbers from my phone. Then I called my phone company and had my number changed entirely, giving the new contact information only to Patricia, Elena Rodriguez, Robert Chen, and the property management company. The freedom of being unreachable was intoxicating. For 30 years, I'd been available to solve other people's problems at any hour of the day or night. Tenants called with emergencies. Jessica and Marcus called with requests for money or assistance. Friends and neighbors called, assuming I'd always have time to listen to their troubles or help with their projects. Now, suddenly, my time was entirely my own. I could spend an entire day reading without interruption, explore a new city without checking in with anyone, make decisions about my schedule without considering how they might affect other people's plans. When I returned from Charleston, I found a stack of letters that had been slipped under my apartment door. All of them were from Jessica and Marcus, progressing from requests for reconciliation to demands for response to threats about involving other family members in our dispute. I gathered them all into a manila envelope and dropped it off at Elena Rodriguez's office without reading the contents. "Standard escalation pattern," Elena observed when she called me after reviewing the letters. "They're testing different pressure points to see which approach might work. The threats about involving relatives suggest they're running out of options." "What relatives?" "David's parents died years ago, and my sister lives in Oregon. We talk maybe twice a year. It doesn't matter if they actually have leverage with other family members. The point is to make you worry about your reputation or your relationships, to create anxiety that might make you reconsider your boundaries." Elena was right. Even reading her summary of the letters created a flutter of worry about what Jessica and Marcus might be telling people, what version of events they might be spreading to make me look unreasonable or cruel. But that worry was immediately followed by a more powerful realization. I didn't care what anyone thought about my decision to prioritize my own well-being over my children's convenience. The next phase of my transformation began with a conversation I hadn't expected to have. Mrs. Bracero Rodriguez from apartment 2A knocked on my door one afternoon with a plate of homemade cookies and a concerned expression. "Loretta, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you okay? I haven't seen Jessica or Marcus in weeks, and there were some people here last month asking questions about the building." I invited her in for coffee, curious about what questions strangers might have been asking about my property. Mrs. Rodriguez had been a tenant for 5 years, always paid her rent on time, and had become something of an unofficial building coordinator who organized holiday parties and kept track of everyone's well-being. 2 people came by asking about the building's ownership, whether it might be for sale, and who made decisions about tenant policies, she explained. They seemed to know a lot about the property already, like they'd been doing research. My blood went cold as I realized Jessica and Marcus had been interviewing my tenants, probably trying to gather information that might support their legal claims or help them find vulnerabilities in my management of the building. They'd been approaching my tenants while I was unaware, potentially creating confusion or concern about the stability of their housing situation. Did they identify themselves? They said they were doing market research for a real estate investment company, but something felt off about the conversation. They asked very specific questions about maintenance response times, whether tenants were satisfied with management, and if anyone had complaints about building policies. I called Elena Rodriguez immediately and described what Mrs. Rodriguez had told me. Elena's response was swift and decisive. "This constitutes harassment and potentially stalking behavior. They're creating a pattern of unwanted contact and attempting to interfere with your business relationships. We need to pursue a restraining order immediately. Will that actually stop them? A restraining order makes any further contact or interference a criminal matter, rather than a civil dispute. It also creates legal consequences for violating the order, which most people take seriously even if they've been ignoring other boundaries. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Elena prepared a comprehensive file documenting every attempt Jessica and Marcus had made to contact me, access my property, or interfere with my business, since I'd asked them to leave. The evidence was more extensive than I'd realized. The threatening text messages, the attempts to enter my apartment with a lawyer, the interrogation of my tenants, and the documented research into claiming ownership of my building. Your Honor, Elena addressed the judge, the respondents have engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment designed to coerce Ms. Clarke into providing them with free housing and potentially to establish claims against her property. This goes far beyond normal family disagreement and constitutes a threat to Ms. Clarke's safety, financial security, and business operations. Jessica and Marcus appeared at the hearing with their own attorney, a young man who seemed uncomfortable with the evidence Elena presented. When the judge asked for their response to the allegations, their lawyer's argument focused on family relationships and claimed misunderstandings rather than addressing the specific behaviors documented in the restraining order request. Your Honor, these are family members who are simply trying to resolve a housing dispute. There's been no violence or direct threats, and the communications have been attempts to reconcile rather than harass. The judge reviewed the evidence for several minutes before responding. Counselor, attempting to gain unauthorized access to someone's property, interviewing their business contacts without permission, and researching legal strategies to claim ownership of someone else's assets goes well beyond normal family communication. The pattern of behavior suggests escalating attempts to control Ms. Clarke's property and financial decisions despite her clear statements that such contact is unwelcome. The restraining order was granted for 1 year, with provisions that Jessica and Marcus could not contact me directly or indirectly, could not come within 500 feet of my building, and could not interfere with my tenants or business operations. Violation of any part of the order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. As I left the courthouse with Elena, I felt a sense of closure that had been building for weeks. The legal system had validated my right to live without harassment, to make decisions about my property without interference, and to prioritize my own well-being over other people's desires to control my resources. But the real transformation was still developing. With Jessica and Marcus legally prevented from contacting me and my building protected from their schemes, I began to understand how much energy I'd been spending on managing their emotions, anticipating their demands, and trying to maintain peace with people who had no interest in reciprocating my efforts. I started filling that recovered energy with activities I'd never allowed myself to consider. I took a cooking class focused on cuisines I'd never tried, joined a book club that met in a wine bar downtown, and signed up for a pottery workshop that met on Thursday evenings. For the first time in decades, my social calendar was based on my own interests rather than obligations to other people. The book club was particularly revelatory. The other members were women in their 50s and 60s, who'd also reached a point in their lives where they were prioritizing their own growth and enjoyment over traditional caregiving roles. During one discussion about a novel dealing with family dysfunction, a woman named Carol shared her own story of setting boundaries with adult children who'd been taking advantage of her generosity. The hardest part wasn't saying no, Carol said. It was realizing that I'd been enabling their irresponsibility by protecting them from consequences. I thought I was being a good mother, but I was actually preventing them from learning to be functional adults. The conversation that followed was like group therapy disguised as literary discussion. Several women shared stories of adult children who'd moved back home and never left, spouses who'd assumed their wives would handle all domestic responsibilities regardless of their own careers, and parents who'd expected constant caregiving without offering gratitude or reciprocal support. What changed for me, said another woman named Diane, was realizing that martyrhood isn't a virtue. Sacrificing your own well-being to enable other people's bad behavior doesn't make you noble. It makes you complicit in your own mistreatment. Complicit in my own mistreatment. The phrase resonated with uncomfortable accuracy as I thought about the months I'd spent sleeping on my own couch, cleaning up after parties I hadn't been invited to, and absorbing increasing levels of disrespect because I didn't want to create conflict. I'd been so focused on being a good mother, a supportive parent, and a family peacekeeper that I'd forgotten to be a person with my own needs, preferences, and right to comfortable living in my own home. Every time I'd accepted behavior I found unacceptable, I'd been teaching Jessica and Marcus that my boundaries were negotiable, and my comfort was less important than their convenience. 6 months after the restraining order was finalized, I made the most radical decision of my new life. I sold the building. The choice wasn't driven by financial necessity or fear of further harassment from Jessica and Marcus. The trust structure Robert Chen had created meant they couldn't interfere with any sale, and the restraining order had effectively ended their attempts to contact me or my tenants. Instead, I sold the building because I realized I'd been letting property ownership define my identity and limit my possibilities for 30 years. I'd thought of myself as Loretta the landlord, Loretta the property manager, Loretta who owned the building on Riverside Drive. But underneath those roles was simply Loretta, a woman who'd worked hard, made smart financial decisions, and earned the right to live however she chose. The building sold for $3 million. After paying off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, I netted approximately $6 million in cash, more money than I'd ever imagined having, and more freedom than I'd experienced since my children were born. I used part of the proceeds to buy a small condominium in a different part of the city, a modern unit in a building with a doorman, a fitness center, and enough security that I never had to worry about unexpected visitors. The mortgage payment was minimal, the maintenance was handled by a professional management company, and my neighbors were strangers who respected each other's privacy. The rest of the money went into conservative investments that would provide steady income for the rest of my life, eliminating any anxiety about retirement funds or long-term care costs. For the first time since David died, I was financially secure without having to work, manage property, or depend on anyone else's contributions to my household. But the most significant change wasn't financial. It was the realization that I could design my life around my own preferences rather than other people's expectations or needs. I started traveling regularly, taking trips I'd dreamed about for decades, but never felt free to pursue. I visited European cities with thousand-year-old architecture, spent weeks in national parks learning about geology and wildlife, and took cruises where my biggest decision was whether to attend the morning lecture or the afternoon cooking demonstration. Each trip reinforced my growing understanding that I'd spent most of my adult life in a very small world, defined by obligation and routine. There were entire categories of experience I'd never allowed myself to explore because I'd been too busy being responsible for other people's comfort and success. The most liberating part of traveling alone was discovering that I was excellent company for myself. I could spend hours in museums without worrying about someone else getting bored, choose restaurants based on my own food preferences, and change my plans spontaneously without consulting anyone else's schedule or budget. A year after the restraining order expired, I received a letter forwarded through Elena Rodriguez's office. It was from Marcus, written on letterhead from a company I didn't recognize. "Dear Mom," it began. "I wanted you to know that I've started my own business, and I'm doing really well. Jessica is working as a freelance graphic designer and has her own apartment now. We've both learned a lot about independence and responsibility since we moved out of your place. I hope you're doing well and maybe we can talk sometime." The letter was polite, respectful, and completely different in tone from the angry demands and legal threats that had characterized their previous communications. It was also obviously calculated to suggest that they'd learned their lesson and were ready to resume a relationship on more appropriate terms. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding, not because I was still angry, but because I no longer felt any obligation to manage their emotions or validate their growth. If Marcus and Jessica had genuinely learned to be independent and responsible, that was good for them. But their personal development didn't create any obligation for me to resume a relationship that had been destructive to my well-being. The peace I'd found wasn't dependent on their approval, their understanding, or their forgiveness. It was based on the simple recognition that I had the right to choose how to spend my time, energy, and resources based on what served my own happiness and security. 2 years after I'd slept on my own couch while strangers partied in my bedroom, I was sitting on a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean, reading a book I'd chosen because it interested me, drinking wine I'd selected because I liked the taste, and planning the next day's activities based entirely on my own preferences. My phone didn't ring with demands for money or housing or emotional support. My schedule wasn't dictated by other people's emergencies or expectations. My living space was arranged according to my own taste and comfort, and no one had access to it who didn't respect my right to peaceful enjoyment of my own home. I thought about the woman I'd been just 2 years earlier, the one who'd convinced herself that accepting mistreatment was a form of love, that enabling other people's irresponsibility was maternal devotion, and that her own comfort was less important than maintaining family harmony at any cost. That woman had been afraid of conflict, terrified of being seen as selfish or unreasonable, and convinced that good mothers sacrificed endlessly for their children regardless of how those children treated them in return. She'd been trapped by her own generosity and paralyzed by the fear that setting boundaries would make her a bad person. But boundaries, I'd learned, weren't walls designed to keep people out. They were property lines that defined where my responsibility ended and other people's responsibility began. They weren't cruel or selfish. They were necessary for any healthy relationship. The woman sitting on that Mediterranean balcony was someone I'd never imagined I could become. Financially secure, emotionally independent, and completely comfortable with her own company. She made decisions based on her own values rather than other people's opinions, chose relationships that added joy to her life rather than obligations, and understood that love without respect wasn't love at all. As the sun set over the water, turning the sky colors I'd never taken time to notice before, I raised my glass in a private toast to the night I'd been forced to sleep on my own couch. It had been the beginning of the worst period of my relationship with my children, but it had also been the beginning of the best period of my relationship with myself. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can lose is the version of yourself that everyone else expects you to be. Sometimes the most important door you can close is the one that people have been walking through without permission. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the radical recognition that your own peace of mind is worth more than anyone else's convenience. I'd learned to sleep soundly in my own bed, in my own space, surrounded by my own choices. And I'd never been happier to be alone. The months that followed my move to the condominium were like learning to breathe in a different atmosphere. Everything felt lighter, from the morning routine that was entirely my own to the evening silence that belonged to me completely. I woke up when my body felt rested, rather than when someone else's schedule demanded it. I made coffee for one person and drank it while reading news articles I found interesting, rather than listening to complaints about problems I hadn't created. The condominium building was a revelation in what peaceful living could look like. My neighbors were professionals who worked regular hours, retirees who respected each other's privacy, and young couples who kept their social lives appropriately contained within their own units. The hallways stayed quiet after 10 o'clock, the common areas were maintained by people who actually lived there, and no one assumed that their personal convenience took priority over everyone else's comfort. But the most profound change wasn't in my living situation. It was in how I thought about my own life and what I deserved from the people in it. For 62 years, I'd been operating under the assumption that my value was determined by how much I could provide for others, how many problems I could solve, and how much inconvenience I could absorb without complaint. Now I was discovering that my value was inherent, not earned, and that relationships based on mutual respect felt completely different from relationships based on one-sided obligation. The first test of my new boundaries came from an unexpected source. My sister Helen called from Oregon with news that she was getting divorced and needed a place to stay while she sorted out her finances. We'd never been particularly close, talking maybe twice a year on birthdays and holidays, but she'd apparently decided that my newfound independence made me an ideal solution to her housing crisis. "Loretta, I know we haven't talked much lately, but I'm really in a bind here," she said during a phone call that came at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. "Tom's keeping the house and I need somewhere to land for a few months while I find my own place. I could fly out this weekend if that works for you." The old version of myself would have said yes immediately, would have spent the rest of the call asking about her emotional state and offering reassurances that everything would work out fine. The old version would have started making plans for converting my home office back into a guest room and figuring out how to accommodate another person's routines and preferences in my carefully organized life. Instead, I found myself asking questions I'd never thought to ask before. "Helen, what's your timeline for finding your own place? And what's your budget for temporary housing? Well, I'm not really sure yet. The divorce is still being finalized, and I don't know what my financial situation will be. I was thinking maybe I could stay with you for a while until things get settled. How long is a while? I don't know, maybe 6 months? Maybe longer, depending on how the property settlement goes. 6 months or longer of someone else's uncertainty disrupting the peace I'd worked so hard to establish. 6 months of adjusting my schedule, my space, and my routines to accommodate someone who hadn't even considered what she could contribute to the arrangement. 6 months of being the solution to someone else's problems while they figured out their life. Helen, I appreciate that you're going through a difficult time, but I'm not able to provide long-term housing. I can help you research extended stay hotels or short-term rental options in your area if that would be useful. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Helen finally spoke, her voice carried a tone I'd never heard from her before, a mixture of surprise and indignation that suggested she'd never considered that I might say no. Loretta, I'm your sister. I'm not asking for money, just a place to stay while I get back on my feet. Don't you think families should help each other? Family should help each other. The phrase that had been used to justify months of exploitation and disrespect, now being deployed by someone who'd shown minimal interest in my life for decades but suddenly saw me as a convenient resource. Helen, help and indefinite housing aren't the same thing. I'm happy to help you research options and provide emotional support, but I'm not available to solve your housing situation. I can't believe you're being so selfish. When did you become this kind of person? Selfish. The word that gets used whenever someone with boundaries refuses to sacrifice their well-being for someone else's convenience. The accusation that gets thrown at people who've learned the difference between being helpful and being used. I became the kind of person who learned that saying yes to things that don't work for me isn't actually helpful to anyone. It just creates resentment and unsustainable situations. Helen hung up without saying goodbye, and I realized that I felt relieved rather than guilty. 6 months earlier, that conversation would have ended with me agreeing to house a sister I barely knew for an indefinite period while she worked through problems she'd created. Now it ended with me maintaining the boundaries that protected my peace of mind and financial security. The Helen situation was just the beginning of what I came to think of as the boundary testing phase. Word had apparently gotten out through various networks that I'd changed my living situation and had resources available. Because over the next few months, I received an unusual number of requests for help, loans, and assistance from people I hadn't heard from in years. An old coworker from the diner called asking if I could co-sign a loan for her daughter's car. A neighbor from my old building reached out, wondering if I could help with her medical bills. A former tenant who'd moved out 3 years earlier contacted me about investing in his new business venture. Each request came with elaborate explanations about temporary hardship and promises of quick repayment. But they all had the same underlying assumption, that my resources were available to solve other people's problems. Each time, I practiced the same response I'd given Helen. I listened politely, expressed appropriate sympathy for their situations, and then explained that I wasn't available to provide financial assistance or solve their problems. The reactions ranged from surprised acceptance to angry accusations about my selfishness, but the pattern was consistent. People who'd shown little interest in my well-being when I was struggling suddenly felt entitled to my support now that I was stable. The most difficult request came from Patricia, the friend who'd been so supportive during my transformation. She called one evening with news that her son had been arrested for drug possession and needed bail money she couldn't afford. Loretta, I know this is a huge ask, but I'm desperate. The bail is $5,000 and I don't have it. Could you possibly lend it to me? I'll pay you back as soon as I can refinance my house. Patricia had been genuinely helpful during the worst period with Jessica and Marcus. She'd listened without judgment, offered practical advice, and never made me feel guilty for prioritizing my own well-being. If anyone deserved my help, it was her. But I'd also learned that help and financial rescue were different things, and that lending money to people who couldn't afford to lose it was a recipe for destroying relationships. Patricia, I'm so sorry about your son's situation. That must be incredibly stressful for you. I can't provide the bail money, but I can help you research other options, or provide emotional support while you figure out what to do. Loretta, please. I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice. You know I'm good for it. The plea in her voice was genuine, and the temptation to solve her immediate problem was stronger than it had been with Helen or the other requests. Patricia was a real friend who'd shown up for me when I needed support. But I'd also learned that mixing money with relationships, even good relationships, created obligations and expectations that could poison the friendship. I know you would pay me back if you could, but what if the refinancing doesn't work out? What if your son gets into more legal trouble? What if your financial situation gets worse instead of better? Then we both have problems and our friendship becomes about money instead of mutual support. Patricia was quiet for a long moment before responding. I understand. You're probably right. I just feel so helpless watching him sit in jail when I could get him out if I just had the money. You're not helpless, Patricia. You're dealing with a situation that requires more resources than you have right now. That's not the same thing as being helpless. And it's not your fault that you can't solve every problem your adult son creates. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest discussions I'd ever had about the difference between love and financial rescue. Patricia talked about feeling guilty that she couldn't bail out her son, and I shared what I'd learned about enabling versus supporting. We discussed how providing bail money might actually prevent her son from facing the consequences that could motivate him to address his drug problem. By the end of the call, Patricia thanked me for refusing her request. You're right that lending money would have complicated our friendship. And you're probably right that bailing him out wouldn't actually help him learn to handle his own problems. The boundary testing phase taught me something crucial about the difference between relationships based on mutual respect and relationships based on resource extraction. The people who genuinely cared about my well-being accepted my boundaries without argument and continued to value the friendship regardless of what I could provide. The people who were primarily interested in what I could do for them became angry or disappeared entirely when I stopped being available for exploitation. By the end of my first year in the condominium, my social circle had naturally sorted itself into people who enjoyed my company for its own sake. The book club continued to be a source of stimulating conversation and genuine friendships. I'd connected with neighbors who shared interests in travel and cultural activities. I'd maintained relationships with professional contacts who respected my expertise without expecting me to solve their personal problems. Most importantly, I'd learned to enjoy my own company in ways I'd never experienced before. I could spend entire days reading, cooking elaborate meals for myself, or working on artistic projects without feeling guilty about being unproductive or antisocial. I could make spontaneous decisions about how to spend my time without consulting anyone, or considering how my choices might affect other people's schedules. The freedom to be selfish in the healthiest sense of the word was intoxicating. I could choose restaurants based on what I wanted to eat, rather than what someone else could afford or preferred. I could plan vacations around my interests, without compromising on destinations or activities. I could decorate my home according to my taste, without considering anyone else's opinions or preferences. One afternoon, while rearranging furniture in my living room for the pure pleasure of creating a space that felt perfect to me, I thought about the woman I'd been just 2 years earlier. She'd been so focused on meeting everyone else's needs that she'd forgotten she had preferences of her own. She'd been so afraid of being seen as selfish that she'd allowed herself to be used by people who felt no guilt about taking advantage of her generosity. That woman had believed that love meant accepting whatever treatment other people chose to give her, that family meant unlimited forgiveness for unlimited disrespect, and that being a good person required sacrificing her own comfort for everyone else's convenience. She'd confused enabling with nurturing, obligation with love, and martyrdom with virtue. The woman I'd become understood that love without respect was just manipulation, disguised as affection. She knew that family relationships required the same boundaries and mutual consideration as any other healthy relationship. She learned that being a good person meant treating herself with the same kindness and consideration she offered to others. The second year in my condominium brought adventures I'd never imagined possible. I took a cooking class in Tuscany, where I learned to make pasta from scratch and discovered that I had a natural talent for combining flavors. I spent 3 weeks in New Zealand, hiking trails through landscapes that looked like movie sets, carrying everything I needed in a backpack, and sleeping in hostels with travelers half my age. Each trip reinforced my growing confidence in my ability to navigate the world independently. I learned to trust my instincts about people and situations, to ask for help when I needed it without feeling ashamed, and to change my plans when something wasn't working without seeing it as failure. The most transformative experience came during a solo trip to Scotland, where I'd booked a week-long photography workshop in the Highlands. I'd never considered myself artistic, but something about the combination of stunning landscapes and technical challenge appealed to me in ways I hadn't expected. On the fourth day of the workshop, while photographing sunrise over a mountain lake, I met James McIntyre, a retired teacher from Edinburgh, who'd been taking photography classes for 5 years. The relationship was comfortable and easy, based on mutual interest and respect, rather than need or obligation. 6 months after the Scotland trip, James suggested we take a photography tour through Iceland together. Not as a romantic relationship, but as travel companions who enjoyed each other's company and shared similar interests. The proposal felt both exciting and terrifying in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I'd never traveled with anyone other than family members, never shared space with someone who wasn't related to me, never navigated the kind of friendship that existed somewhere between acquaintance and romance. But I'd also learned that the most rewarding experiences often came from saying yes to opportunities that felt slightly uncomfortable. The Iceland trip was a revelation in what companionship could look like when both people were responsible for their own happiness and emotional well-being. James and I shared photography tips and location suggestions, but we also gave each other space for solitary exploration and reflection. We had dinner together most evenings, but spent days pursuing our own interests, without feeling obligated to entertain each other or manage each other's moods. Most importantly, neither of us expected the other person to solve our problems or fulfill our unmet needs. We were two complete individuals who enjoyed each other's company, rather than two people looking for someone else to make their lives feel worthwhile. The trip cemented our friendship and established a pattern of shared adventures that enriched both our lives without creating dependence or obligation. We began planning annual trips together, always with separate accommodations and the understanding that either of us could change our plans without affecting the other person's experience. Through James, I met other travelers and photographers who became part of an informal network of people who'd chosen independence and adventure over conventional expectations about what life should look like in their 60s and 70s. These were people who'd learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between being alone and being lonely. The community I found wasn't based on shared problems or mutual support for each other's struggles. It was based on shared enthusiasm for exploration, learning, and the kind of friendship that enhanced rather than complicated each other's lives. 3 years after sleeping on my own couch while strangers partied in my bedroom, I was sitting in a cafe in Prague with James and 2 other photographers we'd met during our travels. We were planning a trip to photograph cherry blossoms in Japan, debating the merits of different regions, and discussing the technical challenges of capturing flowers in various lighting conditions. The conversation was exactly the kind I'd never imagined having, focused on shared interests rather than shared problems, planning adventures rather than managing crises, discussing possibilities rather than limitations. These were people who'd learned to create lives based on their own preferences, rather than other people's expectations. As I listened to James describe a temple garden he'd photographed near Kyoto, I thought about the letter from Marcus that was still filed away in my home office, unanswered and unlikely to ever receive a response. He'd written about learning independence and responsibility, about building a business and growing as a person. If those things were true, I was genuinely happy for him. But his growth didn't create any obligation for me to resume a relationship that had nearly destroyed my sense of self-worth. The peace I'd found wasn't dependent on forgiveness or reconciliation or family harmony. It was based on the radical recognition that I had the right to choose how to spend my time and energy based on what served my own well-being and happiness. Some relationships were worth the effort required to maintain them, others were not. The Japan trip was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. We spent 2 weeks moving through landscapes that looked like paintings, capturing images of flowers that bloomed for just a few days each year, staying in traditional inns where every detail had been designed to create tranquility and beauty. On our last morning in Kyoto, I woke before dawn and walked through temple gardens that were empty, except for gardeners preparing for the day's visitors. The cherry trees were at peak bloom, their branches heavy with flowers that would begin falling within days. The temporary nature of their beauty made it more precious, not less. As I photographed the sunrise filtering through pink petals, I thought about the temporary nature of all the things we spend our lives trying to preserve. The family relationships I'd damaged myself trying to maintain. The sense of duty that had kept me trapped in unsustainable situations. The fear of being seen as selfish that had prevented me from pursuing my own happiness. All of it had been as temporary as cherry blossoms. Beautiful, perhaps, but not worth sacrificing everything else to maintain. The peace I'd found by letting go of relationships that didn't serve me was as lasting as the mountains surrounding the temple, solid and enduring and entirely my own. When I returned from Japan, I found another letter forwarded through Elena Rodriguez's office. This one was from Jessica, written on professional letterhead that suggested she'd found stable employment. "Dear Mom," it began, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us, and I want you to know that I understand now why you did what you did. I was taking advantage of your kindness and treating your home like it belonged to me. I'm sorry for that and for all the ways I made your life difficult. I hope someday we can have a conversation about rebuilding our relationship, but I understand if you're not ready for that." The letter was more thoughtful than Marcus's had been, more genuinely apologetic and self-aware. It acknowledged specific behaviors rather than offering vague apologies for misunderstandings. It didn't make demands or create urgency around responding. I read it twice, then filed it away next to Marcus's letter without responding. Not because I was still angry, but because I no longer felt any obligation to manage their emotional growth or validate their progress toward becoming better people. If Jessica had genuinely learned to be more considerate and responsible, that was good for her and for the people in her current life. But her personal development didn't create any responsibility for me to resume a relationship that had been harmful to my well-being. The woman who'd raised Jessica and Marcus had believed that unconditional love meant accepting unlimited disrespect, that being a good mother required sacrificing everything for her children, regardless of how they treated her in return. She'd confused enabling with nurturing and had nearly destroyed herself trying to save people who didn't want to be saved. The woman I'd become understood that love with boundaries was healthier than love without limits, that relationships required mutual respect to be sustainable, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to participate in someone else's destructive patterns. As I prepared for another photography trip with James, this time to photograph the northern lights in Norway, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that couch to this life. It had started with a single night of sleeping where I didn't belong while strangers occupied my personal space. It had continued through months of legal consultations, boundary setting, and the gradual recognition that I deserved better treatment than I'd been accepting. But the real transformation had been internal, learning to distinguish between solitude and loneliness, between independence and isolation, between healthy selfishness and destructive martyrdom. Learning that my value wasn't determined by how much I could provide for others or how much inconvenience I could absorb without complaint. The Northern Lights trip was magical in ways that justified every difficult decision I'd made to get there. Standing in the Arctic darkness with James and our cameras, watching green curtains of light dance across the star-filled sky, I felt the kind of joy that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be with exactly the right people. This was the life I'd built by choosing my own well-being over other people's convenience, by prioritizing my own happiness over their comfort, by refusing to sacrifice my peace of mind for their approval. It was a life that wouldn't have been possible if I'd continued accepting treatment that diminished my sense of self-worth or enabling behavior that prevented other people from growing up. As the aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that no photograph could fully capture, I raised my camera and smiled. Some things were too beautiful to preserve perfectly, too precious to hold on to forever. But that didn't make them less valuable. It made them exactly what they were supposed to be. Perfect moments in an imperfect world, experienced fully by someone who'd finally learned to put herself first. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.